talk about the history of language, we're actually talking about it in more than one way. We can talk about the origins of language, certainly, and when we think about where does language come from, well, there's a biological argument about the origins of language. There is also kind of an anthropological or historical argument about the origins of language. Firstly, if we think about it in terms of biological arguments, the natural history of language, then we could say, well, where does language come from? Does it have its origins in some part of our brain? Is there a bit of our brain that is responsible for the fact that we have this thing called language? Is it to do with the fact that the way in which our vocal cords and biological apparatus, our manner and place of articulation are organised, that is where language comes from? Is it genetic? How do we know where it comes from? Why is it that we have language and that other animals don't? What is it that we have? Where does it originate from? Where does it stem from? Where do we see it in children? Well, there are two standard arguments that have been historically made about the origins of language. One of the arguments is that the origins of language come from society, that a child is born into a society where everybody is using language, where their parents, their friends, everybody, their brothers and sisters, they're all using language, so it is inevitable that the environment in which that child is born enables them to develop language because they are surrounded by it, they are influenced by it. It is happening everywhere they look and everywhere they hear. So it happens behavioristically. It happens because it is a mode of behaviour which is typical, archetypal, and we follow the particular patterns of those archetypal behaviours. Well, that argument, which was really championed by a man called B.F. Skinner, we refer to that as a behaviouristic idea of language, and certainly we can see a certain validity to that. For example, if you are born in England and you grow up in England, you are likely to grow up learning to speak the English language. You're not going to grow up learning to speak Bangladeshi. You're not going to grow up learning to speak Celtic languages. However, if you are born in, for example, Brazil, then you are likely to grow up speaking Brazilian Portuguese. You're not likely to grow up speaking Russian. Well, you cannot deny that the environment is a factor in that. It's because you are surrounded by the English language that you grow up speaking it. It's because you are surrounded by Brazilian Portuguese that you grow up speaking that. The environment is clearly a factor. However, here's where we come back to our old friend Noam Chomsky, because Noam Chomsky actually countered this behaviouristic Skinner idea of the environment being the source of language by saying, well, actually, no, that actually doesn't explain the phenomena of language as we see it. We're going to be looking at several principles or ideas of how we can challenge that idea of environmentally development, the environment being the origin of language. We're going to look at, for example, the speed by which we acquire language. We acquire language at a fantastic speed, a speed which is actually, frankly, rather puzzling. When you think about children who are being born and all they can do is go, wah, and then within, 3 years, you're able to hold a perfectly reasoned conversation with them in a language which is incredibly sophisticated. If you've ever, as an adult, tried to learn a new language, how easy has it been for you? As a grown-up, as an adult, with all of the knowledge and all of the experience and all of the abilities and all the learning strategies that you've got, how easy is it for you to learn a new language, and how long does it take? Well, if you've ever tried it, you'd probably answer, actually, it's pretty hard and it takes a long time. So how do we explain the fact that children seem to find it so easy that they do it without even thinking? 1-year-olds with no education, with no development, with no further understanding, have absolutely no problems at all in developing language, and they do it at frankly, an extraordinary speed. I mean, we find it difficult as adults to learn a new language, the new grammatical structures of a language, even though we already know a language and have learnt a set of grammatical structures. Children at the age of 1 haven't learnt that. So how do they do it? It's a puzzle, and it's a puzzle which cannot be explained purely in terms of environment. Another factor, all human societies use language. Language can't be a purely environmental factor. If you were to grow up in Brazil, you wouldn't grow up learning English, you would grow up learning Brazilian Portuguese. That's because Brazilian Portuguese is spoken in Brazil, but it's not spoken in England. But if language was as environmental as Brazilian Portuguese is environmental, then surely there must be someone who grows up not learning language. There are countries all over the world that don't have Brazilian Portuguese as an environmental influence. If language itself was environmental, there must be somewhere a human society for which language is simply not part of their culture, not part of their history, not part of what they do. But it's not the case. Every single human society has language. It can't therefore be environmental. It has to be something to do with human beings as a species. Thirdly, this idea of a critical age, the idea of the fact that there is a point beyond which we find language learning harder. As children grow up, they learn language at a fantastic rate. How do they do it? I don't know. But whatever it is they have, obviously when we grow up it disappears. We can see a similar kind of process in the animal world. For example, if you look at ducks, when ducks are born, the first thing that they see, or the first object with which they have a relationship, they imprint upon. Now, we've seen these stories before, films like Fly Away Home, where a group of kind of orphaned ducklings imprint upon a human being and assume that that human being is their parent, and will spend the rest of their lives following that human being as though it is their parent and their guardian. They have imprinted upon it. However, you can't do the same thing with an adult duck. You can't take an adult duck and get it to imprint upon you and to follow you. You can't do it. Try it. You can't. Whatever it is that ducklings have at birth which enables them to imprint, it's not there when they grow up. There must be a critical age, a pivotal age at which that process stops. That can't be an environmental factor. The environment doesn't tell you to suddenly stop being able to develop something or learn something. It has to be something which is built within us as a species. Now, there are various other ideas that we're going to be talking about and looking at examples. We are going to be looking at what it is in the brain that enables us to acquire language, particularly these two areas of the brain which seem to correlate with language functions. We are also going to be looking at the arguments that language has its origins in genes, this notion of a FOXP2 gene, which specifically seems to manage our language processes. These are all things to do with the natural history of language. Where does the language originate from in our natural history, us as a species? But we've also got a human history argument. Where does language come from in terms of human history? Throughout the world, there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of different languages. How did they all get to be where they are? Where did it all start from? If we can trace humanity back to a single point of origin, what was the language that that single point of origin had? Well, actually, there is evidence, and there is a really rather complex branch of linguistics which is about studying the human history of language going back through time. And that study has discovered that effectively all of these hundreds and hundreds and thousands of languages have their origins in distinct small family groups of language. For example, the English language has its origins in a family known as Proto-Indo-European. These languages include pretty much all European languages, and also, Sanskrit and Arabic languages, they all have their origins in this one language. So if you're speaking kind of an Arabic or Sanskrit language, you might think that it has entirely nothing to do with the English language, that they are completely different. But actually, the closer you look, you realise that there are so many similarities between those languages that it can't be coincidental, that they must in some way share a common history, a common point of origin. In this session, we're going to be looking at some of those language families and looking at examples of similarities between them. And this will lead us towards next week's topic, where we'll be looking at how language changes. If they have that common origin, how did you move from having that common origin to having this huge array of disparate languages all over the world? How does language change? That's what we'll be looking at next week.